Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Melissa Kane, and I'm the Vice President of BigTentUSA, and I am thrilled to be hosting this evening's conversation between Stacey Abrams and Heather Cox Richardson about understanding and fighting back against the Trump administration and MAGA's coordinated plan to undermine democratic norms and entrench authoritarian power by rewriting history, gutting diversity, targeting higher education, and redrawing congressional maps to dilute representation. Our government, our country feel almost unrecognizable right now. But Big Tent USA remains steadfast in our commitment to defending our democratic values, our Constitution, and the rule of law. Our goal is to empower with facts, guidance, and calls to action so that we can all become stronger, more effective advocates and resistors. Before I hand you over to Stacey and Heather and to our brilliant moderator, Kimberly Atkins Stohr, I want to highlight the Act Now section of our website at bigtentusa.org. We're going to put that in the chat, the link in the chat. We have a listing there of things that you can be doing right now to take direct action. Take a look. Please share it with your friends. And now it is my very great honor to introduce to you the three extraordinary women we'll be hearing from tonight. Stacey Abrams is a political leader, civic strategist, entrepreneur, and New York Times bestselling author. Stacey served 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, 7 as minority leader, and became the Democratic nominee for governor of Virginia, the first Black woman from a major party to do so, in 2018 and 2022. Over the course of her career, she has launched multiple organizations tackling social issues and building a more equitable future in the South and elsewhere. Dedicated to expanding possibility and progress for current and future generations, she works in the public, nonprofit, and corporate sectors to break barriers for young people, people of color, and the marginalized. Hi, Stacey.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Heather Cox Richardson is a professor of American history at Boston College who has written widely about Reconstruction, the Civil War, and the history of the Republican Party. She's the author of 7 books, including most recently, Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America, as well as the award-winning How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. In July, she was named one of the Time 100 Creators of 2025 for her Letters from an American newsletter, a daily chronicle of the history behind American politics. It has over 2.5 million followers on Substack, millions more on Facebook, and it is worth the read every time. Hi, Heather.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get rid of Charlie. Our moderator for this evening's discussion is Kimberly Atkins Stohr. Kimberly is a senior opinion writer and columnist at the Boston Globe. She's also an MSNBC contributor, a frequent panelist on NBC's Meet the Press, and she is a co-host of the Sisters-in-Law podcast. Previously, Kimberly was the inaugural columnist for The Emancipator, a nonprofit digital magazine collaboration between the Boston Globe and Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research. Welcome back, Kimberly. Welcome back, Stacey. Welcome back, Heather. Thank you so much for coming to the Big Tent for this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for the introductions. I don't want to take up too much time before we jump into our discussion, which is a very important one where we're really looking under 2 umbrellas. One is the erasure of history and its impact on our schools, our colleges, and our other institutions like museums, based on news that came out just today. And the other is about voting rights, or the erosion of them through the process of redistricting at all levels, from local all the way up to federal, and what that means for our democratic future. There will be time left for questions, so if you have them, you can put them in the chat. We've already received so many questions from people who have registered already, and we will get to as many as those as we possibly can. So I want to start off our conversation in talking about the importance of history and the fact that it's being erased through measures that are focused on universities, with the federal government getting involved in the curriculum and making demands upon them, to books disappearing from our schools and libraries, and to even today's announcement that the Smithsonian institution will vet all of its exhibits to see if it conforms with President Trump's vision of America. So I want to start off with you, Heather. Can you paint this moment that we're in right now, where history is being erased in a way that I thought would never happen when I was a student in school reading 1984, and talking, and the way that Orwell talked about that being used? How is that in terms of our history? Have we ever seen something like that before here in America?
No, we haven't. But let's start with today's announcement that a panel of three from the Trump administration is going to be overlooking the exhibits, the grants, every aspect of a number of the different Smithsonian museums. Because one of the things that jumped out to me about that is one of the museums they're going to be reviewing is the Hirshhorn, which is modern art and a sculpture garden. And I thought I would dearly love for a reporter to ask President Trump which his favorite work of art in the Hirshhorn is. Because I would lay money he has never darkened the door of the Hirshhorn. So it's just sort of, an example of what the project here is to institute what is essentially an authoritarian view of history on America in order to destroy what history and what America really is. And what I mean by that is that authoritarians often call the past a perfect time. And they talk about how they could get back to that past. And the assumption in there is that there is a series of divine laws or natural laws that will make the country great again if only those people weren't stopping an authoritarian from doing that. And you can define those people however you want, but the idea is that if you get rid of those people who are stopping the authoritarian, he can make, it's always a he can make things better again. But what really jumps out in this moment about that to me is that if you look at the ways in which states like Florida or Oklahoma have tried to sanitize their history, what they're really taking out of their history is not just events that we care about or people that we care about. Some of those, for example, in the Florida social studies curriculum, largely erased Asian Americans, for example. But the idea that individual ordinary people can change history, what they do is they strip out agency. And I think that's the really insidious part of what's going on here, is the idea that ordinary people don't have control over their destinies, can't work together to change the government. And so one of the things that people like me talk about is that democracy is really always a work in progress. It's never done. The whole idea is you are working all the time to create a society that offers the most justice and fairness to the most people. And if you strip that away and say we can go back to this past that was perfect, what you're doing is you're erasing the agency of 330 million people to change the future. And that's, I think, what we really need to recover.
So, Stacey, can you speak to the importance of having a clear and unobstructed view of our history and our present, frankly, in order for the electorate to be well informed and able to make good decisions about how our nation is governed? Because we have to remember, and I remind people frequently, that we are still a government of the people. It is the people who make the decisions about our government. How can they do that at a time when information and history and even art exhibits are being memory hold?
I want to echo Heather and say part of our responsibility is to understand democracy is a work in progress. It's also a concept. It is not a thing. It is a collective delusion that is wonderful. And it is this notion that if we are all willing to give up something, we all will gain something greater. That the way we process it is by asking each other, what do we think? Knowing that sometimes our values will rise to the top, sometimes our values will be sublimated to someone else's needs, but that we're always in conversation. You can't have conversation when you're not talking. And part of erasing history is about removing topics from the conversation. Heather called it agency, and part of that is power. Government is borrowed power. The people loan our power to those who are in elected office, but also those who are in appointed office, to those who wield power on our behalf. It is borrowed from us. And what is attempted with these memory holes is to make us forget that it's our power. And the best way to do that is to make certain we don't remember the last time someone tried to steal it. And so you erase stories, you erase narrative, you erase lessons that tell us how we get what we've gotten and what was happening before. Exactly. The nature of today is that we are not facing something new. And if you read Letters from an American, her newsletter is just rife with examples that this has been done before. And the work I've been doing recently and that I've been doing through the National Democratic Institute and other organizations is that it's also not endemic to America. Part of what's happening is that we're also being taught this idea that our singularity in this moment means that we can't look anywhere else for lessons. And what I want us to remember is not only are they trying to steal our power and erase our power, they're also trying to create a collective amnesia about what we're capable of. And so I would argue the intention, and it began with their attacks on DEI, and this is something else that Heather alluded to. When you go after DEI, it's not simply Black kids not going to Harvard.
Right.
DEI is the entire construction for 250 years of a nation state where everyone, despite their differences, has a fair opportunity and to participate and is deserving of respect. And it began when we said that working class white men through the Revolutionary War would be allowed to be participants in their governance. So the very first DEI folks in America were white guys who went to the Revolutionary War. Everything that has followed is about how we've built DEI. And so the attack on DEI that began with the very first executive orders were designed to start that erasure. In part, you erase by removing, but the other way you do it is by pitting folks against each other so they can't hear one another. And that, I think, is the most insidious part that I'm seeing happening, because it's not simply that they're erasing our history. They're convincing us that the other person's history isn't worth knowing. And therefore, we will not defend their right to that history, will not defend their right to existence, and we will not defend their right to be. Because when you can create that type of tension and that type of competition, you don't have to do the work anymore. You've now, activated you've activated your victims to fight one another, and you get to live with the spoils.
So, Heather, I want to bounce off of that and talk about the attacks on our universities, with the federal government asking universities for exorbitant amounts of money, trying to force them into agreements that they give up their academic power, the control over their own curriculum. Uh, Talk about how that is a part of a system that we have seen before. We've seen it in places like Germany and elsewhere as part of the autocratic playbook.
So a lot of people know about the Powell memo, which was a blueprint for the taking away of the liberal democracy, the elements of liberal democracy that had been set up after World War II. And it was a memo that was put in place, or that was written by Lewis Powell for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, saying that if the radical right wanted to regain control over the government, it was going to have to monopolize the media space, the legal space, and the universities. And in order to do that, we got things like the rise of the Fox News Channel, the rise of talk radio. We got the rise of the Federalist Society in 1984. And then we also have had this ongoing attack on universities. So that's the backstory. But it's worth remembering and laying out there from the start, this concept that somehow it is a favor to the universities to be getting federal money and not the other way around is simply wrong. The way the system is set up after World War II, the government said, well, we don't really want to have to maintain labs and maintain staff and so on. What we will do is we will work with the universities by giving them grants, and they are the ones that are going to have the labs and the staff and the scientists and so on, so that it will enable the government to get cutting edge research all the time, because we're only going to fund these people for brief periods of time, and then if their experiments don't seem to be paying off or whatever, we will turn elsewhere. So there is this system that went into place after World War II that we've worked under for a very long time. All right, so that's the second backstory. The third piece here is that in order to put in place the requirements of Project 2025, which calls for the implementation of the sorts of things that the Powell memo called for, including the takeover of society, including things like universities, the administration has used a system which is essentially extortion. Trump saying, we are going to pull back all of your billions of dollars of research money, which at this point the universities depend on for their labs, for the staffing, for the electricity that runs them, and so on, unless you do what we say. And what you have seen is a number of universities making the calculation, and the most recent one, I think, is Columbia, that it's worth it to them to hand over about $200 or $220 million in the case of Columbia in order to get more than $1 billion of funding back. But in those agreements, they have specified that they are not admitting to any wrongdoing or any of the above. But we're essentially seeing Trump and the administration using extortion of universities, of law firms where he did something very similar, of different sorts of institutions, and of now businesses, to say, we are going either not to make it so you can have a merger, for example, or we are not going to let you buy a company unless you kick back a significant sum of that money into our hands. And it's a system that is stifling, of course, for universities and for free speech, but it is a dramatic change in the nature of the American government from what a system that used to value free speech, used to value free trade, used to value the idea that you were out there on your own hook for whatever you could accomplish, to a system that looks much more like what a reporter yesterday called state capitalism, which is something that looks a lot like what's happening in China, where the government looks at institutions that used to be independent and says, actually, we're going to decide how you invest. We're going to decide what you study. We're going to decide what you report. And that larger story is really the story of this moment, where people, as Stacey said, think that they are fighting over scraps here and there, and they're fighting over one little issue. What we are all fighting together is the destruction of American democracy in favor of authoritarianism. So the universities are a symbol of that, but they are also, I think, a picture of a much larger story that involves basically every pillar of American society, which is the goal of Project 2025 and the goal way back in 71 of the Powell Memo.
So I know that there will be a lot more questions. I already know there are questions about this that we will get to, but I want to, in the interest of time, turn our discussion to voting rights, and in particular, redistricting. Two things are happening simultaneously. One, the U.S. Supreme Court announced just today that it is fast tracking its rehearing of the Louisiana redistricting case, and in doing so, that case gives the court an opportunity, if it chooses to take it, to gut the remaining key part of the Voting Rights Act that allows people to challenge gerrymandered districts. Also, simultaneously, the fight over Texas redistricting is ongoing, with Democrats still having left the state. They have not returned despite all sorts of threats from Republican officials there. Stacey, I am actually very little surprises me, but after the Supreme Court a few years ago not only declined to gut Section 2, but actually upheld it and applied it in a way to Alabama that found that their maps were unconstitutionally racially gerrymandered, which is why Louisiana and other states redrew their districts to remove racial gerrymanders. But here we are again in a total reversal just a couple years later. as well as this fight in Texas. How did we get here? And should we have seen it coming more than I did?
So I met Heather Cox Richardson in a tiny conference room in Philadelphia a few years ago, where we were contributors to a project on voter suppression. Voter suppression is not new, and it is not news. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is John Roberts. John Roberts was chief lieutenant to William Rehnquist when William Rehnquist was in Arizona. William Rehnquist was the person who essentially imposed language barriers because of the growing Hispanic population in Arizona to block their participation in elections. And he eventually becomes, of course, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. So the obsession with dismantling voting rights is not a new phenomenon. And as a member of the Democratic Party, for anyone who says, well, Democrats did it too, yes, it's a pox on all of our houses. But this is not that. This is not about partisan maneuvering for access. This is about dismantling the very people who are poised to have the largest voices in a participatory democracy. If you look at the demographics of the United States and the demography maps, they will all tell you that in 17 years, the United States is a majority minority country. You tie that back to the Powell memo that Heather referenced, which said, if you want a right-wing government, these are the things you have to do. Well, one of the things you have to do was endemic in the Southern strategy, which is Nixon's approach, which is that you have to suppress voters whose opinions will never align with your intention. And so we have watched this arc of history since 1965 of trying to dismantle not only the Voting Rights Act, but to remove voting rights. And let's situate this. You articulated two very clear ones, but there are three other ones. The SAVE Act is not gone. The SAVE Act will eliminate the right of women to actively participate in elections by creating administrative barriers and administrative hurdles. They are also trying to redo the census. No, they cannot redo the census in 2026, but as they are quietly moving to push the census towards more and more mathematical, it's called imputation. So if you can't get people to answer, they guess based on past data. Well, if you can erode the census between now and 2030, by the time you get to 2030, you're guessing at who's here. So yes, they're going to flag the citizenship question and try to make sure that undocumented people, but it's all of a piece because the districts that are being drawn are drawn based on the census population. The third one we have to pay attention to are voting purges. What's happening in Georgia right now? 478,000 people are being purged from the rolls in the state of Georgia. Across the country, we have seen a number of states pull back and change the way they both let you register and who gets to stay on the rolls. And the reason I think it's important for us to see the full landscape is so that we understand that this is, again, not about who gets to vote or who has ID. This is about how do you dismantle democracy in real time in plain sight. Voter suppression has three facets. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot? And does that ballot get counted? They are attacking every single one of those systems simultaneously. And the reason you have a Supreme Court that 2 years ago, in the same year that they allowed Students for Fair Admissions to gut access to higher education for students of color, they protected Alabama because they didn't have a White House at the time that would have permitted what we're about to see happen. And that is, if you can gut Section 2, and you've already gutted Section 5, and you're going to rejigger and jury rig the census, and you're going to allow states unfettered capacity to strip voters of their rights by pulling them from the rolls, what you are going to create for 26, 27, and 28 is the erasure of a participatory democracy in a nation state that is very quickly moving away from your idealized version of what an American should look like to what an American actually is. And so our response has to not be surprised that the Supreme Court would do so. John Roberts in 2013, in his opinion, very plainly scoffed at the fact that race was still a valuable metric to use in this country to determine access. And it should not be surprising to anyone that the cohort of 6 that currently sits in the court do not believe that the people that are represented by the Voting Rights Act, and that's not just people of color, it's people of color, it's the disabled, it is
Right.
a whole host of communities whose only protections for their participation in democracy is born of the Voting Rights Act. And that is why we should believe them when they tell us they intend to get rid of it.
Stacey, I'm so glad you pointed out all the different ways in which it's a multi-pronged, multifaceted effort to attack voting rights in many ways. And you talked about the purges, which are very important. My stepson just graduated Emory, but during his time there, he was purged from the voting rolls, not once, but twice. And because he was very civically astute, he knew to check it well before the deadlines in doing that. But that puts the onus on people to protect that, Heather. Um, I mean, just talk more about how history has shown that voting rights have always been under attack. Remember that we all didn't even get voting rights. I used to say it took not one but two constitutional amendments for me to vote, but now I realize it has taken much, much more than that. It's taken a continuous fight to ensure that right.
I think it's the one piece that I would add that I think is important here, which is so obvious people tend not to say it, is that they would not be doing this if they thought what they were doing was popular. This is a way for a minority, and in this case, a very small minority, to gain control over the government. And to go back to where Stacey started, this is one of the reasons we have to really be in solidarity with all Americans who believe in protecting American democracy, because there are so many more of us than there are of them. But I will point out that this has been a key object of the Republican Party since 1986. It's in 1986 that the people in Reagan's administration recognized that the second set of tax cuts that he's trying to put through are deeply unpopular with the American people, because they're also cutting services, and the tax cuts are really benefiting the wealthiest people. And we know that between the beginning of Reagan's term in 1981 to the beginning of President Joe Biden's term in 2021, more than $50 trillion moved from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1% of Americans. So in 86, the Reagan administration begins to talk about ballot integrity. And they say in their memos quite openly that they are hoping to kick Black Americans off the voting rolls because they tend to vote Democratic. And it's also in 1980, by the way, that you start to see a gender split in the way men and women in America vote, with women tending to side with the Democrats. But you see it in 86, and then it really takes off in 1994 after the Democrats passed the 1993 Motor Voter Act to try and get more people to vote, recognizing that the idea of a government that works to ensure fairness for everybody, works to make sure that everybody is equal before the law and has a right to a say in their government and has equal access to resources, is enormously popular. So the more people who vote, the more likely Democrats are to be elected. And after the Motor Voter Act of 1993, in 94, the Republicans start to say that the only reason that they are losing at the ballot box is because Democrats are cheating. And at that point, there are two major elections, one in Louisiana and one in California, that the Republicans keep open for a long time, saying this was decided by voter fraud. Now, it wasn't. There was never any evidence of that, but they were out in front of the cameras every night saying, we've got this investigation going. We know there was voter fraud here. And that's where you can also see the instigation of using investigations to salt the idea that there is a problem. That's in 94. And by 98, after a really messy election in Miami in that year, in which no Democrats ran, by the way, Florida begins to purge its rolls, and it purges about 100,000 mainly Black Americans from the voting rolls in Florida in between 1998 and 2000. And we all know what happened in the Florida election of 2000. So you can see this growing pattern. And then, of course, when Barack Obama is elected in 2008, the idea that somehow the Republicans had managed to sew up the White House is proved to be wrong. And so you see in 2010, you see the Citizens United decision. And in 2013, you see the Shelby versus Holder decision that guts the Voting Rights Act. And then again in 2021, you get the decision, the Brnovich decision, that says that even though The new restrictions on voting that Arizona put into place were discriminatory against certain populations. That's okay as long as they weren't intended to be. And anybody who testifies in these cases will tell you it's really hard to prove intent. So, you see this march going forward. And the thing is that the more that a population chooses, or a group of leaders chooses its own voters, the more extreme they get. And this is the moment where we are in the United States right now, where the vast majority of us do not like what the administration is doing. And yet we've been shut out of our votes being counted. So one of the things that you're seeing right now is Gavin Newsom, the governor of California today, has been quite openly saying to Trump, okay, if you want to mess around with redistricting in Texas, for example, or in Ohio where they're talking to people, or in some of these other states, Indiana, go ahead, because California will redistrict and we're going to cancel everything you did. And we've got Illinois and we've got New York as well. And if that were the case and the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives and forced everybody to have a free and fair districting by citizens, which is what a number of Democratic states have done, the Republicans would be, I'm sorry, but SOL for the near future.
Stacey, speak to that, because one thing that is just so clear to me in watching what's happening in Texas is that Texas was becoming a very purple state. And the only way to keep it red would be to redistrict and politically gerrymander the state. But Texas and other places, while the Supreme Court has held that political gerrymandering is something that a challenge they can't even consider, while still technically, as of this moment, racial gerrymanders are illegal under the Voting Rights Act. As I often say, the Venn diagram of a racial gerrymander and a political gerrymander is almost always a circle. So talk about that tactic.
So the case you just referenced, it was an interstitial case between Shelby v. Holder and Bronovich, and that was the common cause case. And
Yes.
so what they did was they said, well, there is no racism anymore, so you're not held accountable for the Voting Rights Act. All of you states that are now waiting, and in fact, within days, started passing deeply racist, very strong voter suppression laws. Then they came back and said, well, common cause did their case, and they said, well, we can't touch political gerrymandering. It just so happens that in all of the states that were once covered by the Voting Rights Act under Section 5, they just so happen, to your point about a perfect circle, they also happen to map almost perfectly race to political identity. And then just in case there were any stragglers, you had the Bronovich decision. Fair Fight, one of the organizations I founded, we brought a case in 2019. The Bronovich decision did not get decided until 2021, but in 2020, we had two things that happened. One, we had the most accessible election in American history because people could vote from home, because they could actually take their time and look things up, because they could go to drop boxes, because they could vote early, because they had all of these options. We had the most accessible elections in American history. And then the next year, and we had the Bronovich decision. And that said, oh, well, now it's okay, unless you can prove that they were sitting in a cloak room with smoke and twirling their mustaches saying, we're going to get those dark people, unless that was I apologize, but unless that was the conversation,
Right.
there was no longer a predicate for argument. And so when we brought our case in 2019, it didn't get decided until 2022. And the interstitial issue was Bronovich. Bronovich basically said that you have to prove intent as opposed to effect. And what they're looking to do in Louisiana is scrap it all together. To your point about Texas, the reason all of this matters is demography. Demography is not destiny, it is opportunity. And Texas is one of those places, like Georgia, that demonstrate what can happen when there is real access to the right to vote. What happened in Texas was that Harris County used every single tool possible to ensure access to elections, and it worked. And that is why Texas is ground zero. Georgia used every tool possible, and it worked. And that is why Georgia has been a laboratory. Florida, Heather just walked through what happened in Florida. And so any place where we start to see true coalitions come together, and let's be clear, Voting is not partisan. Who we pick is partisan, but the act of voting is patriotism. They are attacking patriotism because they do not believe that patriotism will yield the power that they seek. And that is not only being borne out in Texas, it's being borne out in the way they're talking about bringing back the legislators. The fact that they are sicking the FBI on state legislators who are exercising an opportunity that is granted to them under the Texas Constitution. The fact that they're threatening to jail Beto O'Rourke because he has the audacity to invest in protecting democracy. Those behaviors cannot be seen in silos. This is all of a piece. And this comes back to what Heather has said, what I try to say when I talk about the 10 steps to autocracy. These aren't Trump is the chaos agent. He is not the architect.
Right.
He is the distraction. But what they are building was begun long before we got here. And I would go before the Powell memo, go back to 1964, go back to the failure of Barry Goldwater to cross the finish line and the rise of a right-wing belief system that said this may have happened this time, but we are going to make it so that once we hold power, we never lose it again. And so we have to see that there are 10 steps and that all of these pieces fit underneath a very wide set of opportunities. And Texas is simply one example, because if Texas fully represents the needs of its people, then it is highly unlikely that the leadership it has now will be the leadership it has tomorrow.
So we have to move. Oh, go ahead,
Can I
Heather.
just add to that a piece?
Yes, please.
And that is that, speaking of things we've seen before, what we are seeing is essentially the attempt to take the Reconstruction years in the American South national. And the reason that I mention that is not for the obvious reasons, but of the fact that Black and brown Americans and women, of course, and white men who were not part of the ruling cabal had very few rights in the South, but because of the instability caused by a government run by cronies, essentially, there was very little economic investment in the American South in that period. And in fact, it really was poor. It was incredibly poor. There was very little industry. There was almost no social services. People were incredibly sick with the different diseases that were untreated. And that idea that, that we're all in this together, not just because it is morally right, not just because it is fair to our neighbors, but because without a democratic system, capital flees and the economy will be absolutely destroyed, is an important message, I think, for people to remember. Look at a state like South Carolina in 1890 or in the 1920s, when children are working in the mills and losing their fingers, and or West Virginia, where men are working in the mines and 1,000 of them are dying a year, many more maimed by working there. That's the kind of world that we will be looking at if we allow this system to go national.
So I need to move on to questions, because we do need 4 hours to fully vet all of this, but we have so many questions waiting. And one of them really gets to one of my last questions that I wanted to present to you in our discussion, which is, what can we do? The question is, do our actions, for example, protests, letter writing to congresspeople and senators, postcards to our fellow Americans to vote, etc., really make a difference? And I'll expand on that a little bit, just to ask, what can we do? Stacey.
So yes, all of it matters, because one of the first and most basic tools of authoritarianism is silence. If they can silence your dissent, then a numbness sets in and people start to believe it's not worth speaking. So protest feels inadequate because it doesn't yield to immediate result, but it creates the sound that we need. The second thing that we have to remember is that people are elected to office, but the election is the starting gun. It is not the end game. And too often we believe that the postcard that we send is enough. I would say that one of the things we can do is show up at every single public meeting being held wherever you are. And all of us live in places where we can go to a public meeting. It's a school board meeting, a county commission meeting, a city council meeting. It could be the soil conservation board meeting. But we have to be talking about this everywhere. You don't have to simply protest in a march on a Saturday. You can show up at every public meeting. You can fill out every public hearing, every public comment section. We have to flood the zone with our distaste and with our desire to hold our country. As Heather pointed out, they know they're unpopular. The reason the president of the United States is militarily occupying Washington, D.C., is because he is unhappy that people won't stop talking about Jeffrey Epstein, because he also knows that the labor board, that the labor statistics are going to bear out that his economic plans are failing. He knows that he cannot get rid of Jerome Powell. He can't even embarrass him effectively. He knows all of these things are true. And so he uses grand gesture, hoping that we will be distracted from what is failing. We have to show that we understand by talking to our neighbors, but also reminding ourselves that this is still ours. It's borrowed power and we can take it back. The last thing I'll say is that there are organizations out there doing the work, not just of today, but of what's coming next. And I'll drop these in the chat. But I mentioned Fair Fight, which is fighting for free and fair elections. Fair Count, which is fighting for a fair census. We can't wait for 2030 to protect the census. They're coming after it now. We need to defend DEI. I work with a set of organizations, American Pride Rises Network, but I'll drop all of this. But there are organizations working on the different pieces. We have to shore up civil society, because the way it works, the way authoritarianism is most effective, and Heather alluded to this, it's when you break what we know, which is our media, how we know it, what we know, which is our universities and our schools, how we know it, which is our media, and who defends us, and that's our lawyers. And so we've got to be in the habit of actually defending these organizations today, not hoping that after the next election, they will simply be restored, because they will not be. If we lose them now, it will be nearly impossible to bring them back.
Heather, what do you think? What can people do, and what does history teach us about civic action?
So I will add only one thing to what Stacey suggested, and that is that our Constitution quite literally begins, "We the people." As she said earlier, we the people give our power to elected officials to exercise so long as we consent to what they are doing. So expressing your displeasure with an administration is a sign for the people in power, but also for your neighbors, that administration does not have legitimate power. And that actually really matters in our system. And the way you demonstrate that and the way you spread that is exactly what Stacey says. Go to every possible meeting, but also talk to people. Engage with people on social media, not hostilely. A lot of people simply are not paying attention. And they're the people, and they don't want to talk politics. They don't like politics for the most part. The MAGAs are gone. People talk about different ways that you can reach them. If we simply get the people who are not currently engaged and make them understand that this matters to them, that's enough. That's all we need. And the way to do that is by talking to people. Nobody can communicate a political message better than a friend talking and saying, "Hey, are you concerned about, the loss of the rose garden," or whatever your particular issue is, because friends will listen to that. And yes, in fact, one of the things that I think about a lot is how we got, first of all, in the Revolutionary era, from a group of people who in 1763 were proud to be subjects, to the idea in 1776 that they would reject the king and become citizens. And then we did the same thing in the 1850s when the oligarchs, who were the elite slave owners in the American South, took over the US government. We did the same thing in the 1890s when the robber barons took over the government. And we did the same thing in the 1920s and 30s when, again, a very small group of very wealthy people took over our government. And in each of those cases, people came together by talking to each other, for sure. But one of the constructions that I'm really working on right now is that, again, in each of those cases, the way people created a movement was by saying, we are trying to reclaim our traditions, not by saying we want to dramatically change things, but rather by saying, hey, look, these guys are trying to change our country. And that, I think, is an important message, that what people like, I guess I shouldn't speak for anybody else on this call, but certainly that I am talking about is, I 100% stand on the Declaration of Independence. And I describe myself as a conservative because I am trying to conserve the ideas in the Declaration of Independence, that we we are all created equal, that we have a right to be treated equally before the law, we have a right to a say in our government, and we have a right to equal access to resources, including healthcare and education and the different things that one needs to survive in the 21st century. That is traditional, as opposed to saying, in fact, we're going to change the whole nature of American citizenship, which is something that J.D. Vance talks about a lot these days. So that idea that we are not radicals, we are just the opposite. We are trying to preserve the best of the United States of America, and those people who are trying to rip that to shreds are the radicals that we need to reject, is the language of the people who founded the United States of America, of Abraham Lincoln, of Theodore Roosevelt, and of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I mean, we certainly could update it, but I think it's important to remind people that we are not the radicals that people like Donald Trump talks about. We are not communists trying to change the world. We are traditional Americans who are trying to reclaim, things like DEI.
Yeah. So just as we were having this discussion, some news that comes out of Texas is that the state Senate has passed the redistricting map after 2 Democrats remained in the chamber, allowing Republicans to vote on a plan that could add 5 more GOP seats. Unlike House Democrats in the state, Senate Democrats were unable to break quorum because of members who refused to participate. So this is ever evolving, but it's still really perilous. I want to go to another question, which is where is the kickback money from universities and businesses and law firms going into Trump's pockets, his library? Where? Heather, you touched on this a little
I don't
bit.
know. I've been trying to figure this out for a long time, because it's not just that. There's a 15% kickback on the sale of certain chips to China from NVIDIA and one of the other companies. And, there's one of the things about this administration is there's a lot of stuff that is opaque. Do you have any idea, Stacey?
No, I mean, we know, here are the things they've said they're doing. So there's putting the money into his library, although there is no library yet. So where's the money going? There is the agreement to advertise. So Paramount is supposedly going to, the new Paramount Skydance is going to put out certain number of ads that are pro whatever his cause of the day is. The law firms, part of their settlements, said they'd give a certain amount, not in cash, but in representation of his preferred clients. And so it's going to look a lot of different ways. But what we have to come back to is it's basically extortion and corruption in plain sight. And the clawing back of the money is secondary to the permissive nature. And this goes to Heather's point, that we are permitting right now the looting of America by its leaders in a way that we have not seen in I would say ever, and with this level of grotesqueness.
Yeah.
I will make one other point, and this again, and I recognize that partisanship feels icky to some, but let's be clear, this is not MAGA and Trump. This is Republicans. It was MAGA and Trump during an election. But the people who are voting in the Texas State Senate, the people who voted for the mega bill, the people who are remaining silent as people are being stolen off of the streets, kidnapped and deported and incarcerated in gulags, those are Republicans. And so part of our responsibility is to call all of the things what they are. If we use cloaked language, then we are obscuring obligation. And I believe that we have to call it out. We have to call out Democrats who were not doing the right thing and taking the right positions. We have to call out independents, because you don't get to be independent of your patriotism and independent of your citizenship. Your partisanship is not the point. It's the label you are using to justify your behavior. And that's what we have to call out. Because if we want to reclaim our country, we have to be able to identify those who share the traditional values that Heather is laying out.
Our next question is, what do you think of the idea of blue state governments in exile, which keeps its tax money for the benefit of its citizens, funding safety net programs defunded by this regime, and disaster relief, for example? Can blue states just decide, hey, we're taking care of ourselves?
Well, as someone who's only ever lived in red states, I would say, please don't. And here's why. Here's why. Because one, the population shifts in this country are moving more and more towards what are traditionally red states, which is why we're working so hard to make these competitive states, to make certain that no party has such dominion that they don't have to talk to the people. And the minute blue states decide we are going to fracture our compact, then we are justifying a set of behaviors that do not penalize the wealthy. It penalizes the people who rely on those safety nets. So no one's going to feel punished if you take money away from Texas. Texas has enough of it. They simply will cease to do the very little they're doing already. State of Georgia, the state of Florida, these are states that are already doing the very least possible to help their people. If you take that money, they are not the ones who get hurt. The people in power do not feel the pain. The people who will feel the pain are the ones who will be in solidarity if we show up and do this work together.
So can I ask a follow-up to that? What should blue people in blue states and government officials in blue states be doing in this moment?
Stacey, go ahead. I want to hear what you have to say about that.
So I think there are three things. One is what we see Gavin Newsom and JB Pritzker, what we see them doing right now, what Kathy Hochul is doing. We need blue state leaders to use their power. There's a difference in traditional times. In normal times, yes, we should fight by the Marquis de Queensberry rules, where we stand and we pace off and then we turn and we fire on three. That's not where we are now. Where we are now is that we are fighting for the preservation of our nation. And so we should use all of the tools at our disposal, but not tools that punish the people who are the victims of these very attacks. So that's our first job. The second job is that we need people in blue states to invest in the things going right in the red states. Red states tend not to have the resources that blue states have. And if we do have the resources, we can't find them because they're usually held by the people who are fomenting this type of behavior. So we need your investment. And this is not just about money. It's about time, talent, and treasure. If you have any of those three, give them. We need you. And that's the third piece. And this is the mutual aid piece. The reason you break government is because people will give up democracy if they think autocracy will get them what they need. So if you look at the pantheon of democracies that have fallen to autocracy in the 20th and 21st centuries, it's not simply because you had a strong man, and it's always, as Heather pointed, it's always men. It's because they were able to argue that democracy wasn't delivering, and therefore autocracy was the only way you would get what you needed. So if you're watching Trump standing in DC yesterday, he's doing Filipino President Duterte, saying he's going to clean the streets and you'll be safe. And that got Filipinos for a time to say, well, we want to be safe, so we will let you trample on our rights. If you are Viktor Orban, you are saying that it's this community of people who are the reason you don't have anything. And so we will let you oppress an entire population if it justifies our convenience and guarantees us what we need. The reason that's so important is that we have to hold to our responsibility, that if government is failing, we've got to show up and show that democracy can still deliver, even if it's being delivered by individuals. Your church, your organization, your Girl Scout troop, whatever coalition you have, has to step into the gap. We can't simply bemoan the harm. We have to do our best to mitigate it. We can't solve for it. That's why we created such a vast network of government, of democracy, so we can invest enough. But in the absence of that investment, we cannot let things fall apart, hoping one day we can build it back. We've got to do what we can to mitigate the harm, because that's the best way to create people who are willing to support and suborn autocracy. It's because they don't think democracy holds anything for them.
And I would add only to that one of the things that frustrates me beyond belief is that the radical right has managed to monopolize the information sphere so that people believe that it's the Democrats that are stopping the government from working, when in fact it is the policies of the Republicans. And a great example of that is Trump's declaration that Washington, D.C. is in the middle of this crime wave that has created a hellscape, when in fact crime in Washington, D.C. is at a 30-year low.
Yes, it is.
So the degree to which people can push back with reality through social media challenges toward just simply correcting somebody. I had a friend who said that, said to another friend, well, Donald Trump won 78% of the popular vote. He's the most popular president we've ever had. And my friend said, no, he didn't. More people voted for somebody else than voted for him. And he said, well, that's
Right.
not what I heard. And he said, well, what channel? You know where this is going. That was somebody who started to look at things a little bit more askance after he was corrected calmly with the right information, because the degree to which the right wing has managed to monopolize our information sphere has made people believe things that are not true and believe that democracy isn't an answer, when the truth is democracy always is an answer, except when we have lost it through gerrymandering, voter suppression, and the monopolization of the media. So I sort of feel like an awful lot of that is in our hands, making sure that people truly understand what's going on. And that, again, individuals have far more power in that case than the New York Times or CBS News or whatever, simply because people listen to their neighbors.
If I can add
So
one little note to that,
yes.
it's not only when it comes to DC, when you're arguing that point, the reality is not only that it's at a 30-year low, it's that the Republicans just stripped DC of $1 billion, meaning they just took $1 billion
That's right.
out of the government, including away from law enforcement.
They
They
did.
defunded the police in DC.
They did.
That's the narrative that we have to hang that around Republicans, because they were the ones who voted for that decision, and that's the consequence.
Now,
That
see, I
is,
didn't know
amen.
that.
As yes, that is true. I am a DC resident, so I did know that, and I appreciate you making that note. I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Kane, who has the last question for you.
I think I'm back in. Am I back in? Look,
You
I
are.
don't even want to be back in yet. We could listen to you guys for hours. Your expertise, your ability to clarify so much of this very dense information is what I am hopeful about. And making this information accessible to so many people at our Big Tent, and also through all of your work, is what gives me hope. We do try and ask the question, but I think we're running out of time. Is there anything that's giving you hope? You've alluded a little bit to it, but if you've got a couple of thoughts, we'd love to hear them.
So this is going to sound like a plug, but it's actually legitimate. So I do this podcast called Assembly Required, and I have a Substack called Assembly Notes. And every week I get to talk to people who deconstruct the hard things, but then they always have to give me something we can do. And what gives me hope is that I've yet to have a guest who didn't have something that we can be doing and a way we can be supporting each other. That's, to me, the signal that democracy is still alive here. As long as we have the ability to learn, to engage, to invest, and to protest, to use our voices, that's our power. And of course, what gives me hope a lot is reading Heather Cox Richardson and understanding that we've been here before. We can get through it again. We just have to believe that it's our responsibility.
Well, and I know you've only got a minute left, so I would simply say that I think we are rediscovering our agency, especially women, especially older women, but people across this country who are recognizing that the government hasn't worked for a very long time because of a specific set of people with a specific anti-democratic ideology. And we're taking that back. It's everywhere when you look at it. Look at how many people are here today in this conversation. And I do think we can do it. We've done it in the past. What is going to come out is going to be different than what the country looked like going into this moment. But, I cannot believe that with a coalition across ages and races and genders and abilities and so on, that we will not be able to right this ship, because we've made it upright in the past when it was threatening to founder. So I maintain it's going to be a lot of work, but I maintain that we're going to be able to do this.
Well, we're in it. We're in the fight with you. And as you said, there are a lot more of us than them. Someone said in the chat, listening to you, I know for a fact that I am on the correct side of this fight. And that is how I feel. I think that's how all of us feel. Thank you to all three of you for coming back and speaking with us at Big Tent. Will you come back again? I hope.
Of course.
Anytime.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. There's a lot to digest. We will get it all back out to you. Thank you for being a part of our Big Tent.